Orioles fans had waited 9 years for a home playoff game, and the yard, it was rocking as that one finally got started on Sunday. But the Orioles bats, well, they were not. And we never quite got that chance to explode as a fan base as the Orioles dropped Game 1 3-2 to the Rangers. I'll recap it coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Sunday, October 8th, 2023, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, it is a special weekend edition of the Locked On Orioles podcast. This is my 855th episode that I've hosted the pod, and the first time I've hosted on the weekend. But I told you during the week we were going to do it. Whenever the Orioles had a weekend playoff game, either on a Friday or a Saturday, you would still get a new episode either that night or the next morning. Was potentially planning on getting this out by Saturday night, but was not able to get it out here until Sunday morning. But either way, we've got a playoff baseball game to talk about. The Orioles' first playoff game since 2016, their first home playoff game since 2014, and unfortunately, just like those last two that I mentioned, it was an Orioles loss as the O's fall 3-2 to the Texas Rangers. It's going to be a quicker episode today, just basically almost exclusively focusing on recapping the game. We'll talk a bit about the ALDS roster and Game 2 coming up on Sunday. We're talking mostly Game 1 between the Orioles and Rangers, and I'll get you the 5 things you need to know from that one. So let's jump right into it. Final score, Game 1 at the yard of the ALDS on Saturday. Texas Rangers 3 and the Baltimore Orioles 2 as the Rangers take a 1-0 lead in this best-of-5 series. It was a disappointing loss, really, number one, because we were waiting so long for this and the yard was awesome, and number two, because this really felt like, you know, the biggest game you just had to win if you're the Orioles. This was the pitching matchup that was going to favor you by the most, Kyle Bradish versus Andrew Heaney, and they just couldn't get it done, and they drop 1-0 in the series. But I'm going to get you the 5 things you need to know from the Orioles' loss on Saturday. The first thing you need to know is it was a lot of Orioles players' first playoff games, right? Like, they had a 26-man postseason roster, and only 6 of those players have ever played in the postseason before. So you got 20 players on your team making their postseason debut, and we can talk a lot about this guy looked great, this guy didn't in their first playoff action. Well, Anthony Santander certainly looked great in his first postseason action. Led it off with a single off of Andrew Heaney in the first inning. Had himself a big swing later in the game, a solo home run in the 6th, made it a 3-2 game. Just demolished a changeup. Santander, a great low ball hitter, got a pitch down and out of the zone, hit it 109 off the bat, 420 feet to right center field to make it a 3-2 game off of Dane Dunning. Also had a walk earlier in the game as well. And a really good performance from Santander, who, as we'll talk about later, was really kind of the only Oriole out there doing damage. He was the only Oriole who had multiple hits in this game. He was the only Oriole who reached base 3 times as the O's mustered just 2 runs on 5 hits in this loss. All 3 of the balls he put in play were hard hit as well. Just a really, really impressive first showing from Anthony Santander in the postseason. Now, unfortunately, the second thing you need to know is the rest of the offense really didn't do much. Yes, Ryan Mountcastle had the RBI double in the 4th that put the Orioles on the board, made it a 2-1 game against Ranger starter Andrew Heaney. But the only other hits were Ramon Arias' infield single that could have been called an error, the Gunnar Henderson single in the 9th, and that was it. Those are your Orioles' 5 hits. They did get on base a little bit. You know, they drew 5 walks as well. Hayes, Rutschman, Santander each had 1. And then Aaron Hicks, drew 2 as well. But it was not a great showing from the Orioles offense. And the reason Santander is the transition here is because the biggest issue was even when the O's got some traffic on the bases and got themselves into some scoring spots, right? Like, this was the best team in baseball, batting average-wise, with runners in scoring position this year. And they gave themselves a chance late in that game. It was nice to see them come through in the 4th with the run. Santander hits the homer in the 6th, but you trail 3-2 going to the bottom of the 7th, and you're really into, at this point, the Rangers bullpen. Like, yes, Andrew Haney only lasted 3 2/3, but that was kind of the plan. They brought out another starter, Dane Dunning, to go 2 innings. Then Will Smith faces one batter, strikes out Henderson to end the 6th. Then you really get into the Rangers bullpen starting in the 7th. One of the worst bullpens in baseball. Something I talked about in the series preview. The Orioles should have a good chance to strike against this bullpen. And they had those chances, right? 7th inning. Josh Sabors comes out there, throws 7 consecutive balls. He walks Aaron Hicks on 4 pitches. Then he goes 3-0 to Adam Frazier. And you're thinking, like, it's time, right? This is rally time. And he just comes back with some good pitches to Frazier, who flies out. Cedric Mullins did not have a good AB when he struck out. And then they go to Ryan O'Hearn as a pinch hitter, which was the right move there with Ramon Urias coming up. This was your chance to kind of strike. And O'Hearn took a fastball right down the middle on 3-2 to end the inning. Orioles squandered that chance. Then they go to the 8th. It's still a 3-2 game. Here comes Aroldis Chapman. And the guy still can't throw a strike. He walks Austin Hayes and Adley Rutschman on 9 pitches for the first 2 batters of the inning, and Santander's coming up, right? He's reached base all 3 times. You're thinking, all right, at the very least, the Orioles are tying the game right here, and they might just take the lead in the 8th inning. And instead, Santander hits a chopper to third. Josh Young makes a great play, turns a double play, and all of a sudden, the inning flips on its head. And it's such a Chapman inning, right? We've seen Aroldis Chapman a million times. He can't find the strike zone, walks 2 guys, and then immediately turns filthy, gets a double play, and then throws 102 by Ryan Mountcastle to get the strikeout with the tying run at third and 2 down to get out of the inning. And that was really the big chance that the Orioles squandered, because you get the 2 walks on the 9 pitches, and you got Chapman on the ropes, and just, it's unfortunate, right? Because you want to be upset with Anthony Santander for grounding into a double play, but he was basically the Orioles' entire offense in his first 3 plate appearances into the 8th inning. That was the guy you wanted up in that spot. It just didn't work out. And sometimes that is postseason baseball right there. Like, things just don't work out in your favor, even though you feel like they should. And that was an unfortunate ending. And then, you get to the 9th inning. And the Orioles once again get the leadoff man on. They did it in the 7th, in the 8th, in the 9th. Gunnar Henderson comes up against Jose Leclerc, the Rangers closer, and immediately singles into right on the 2nd pitch. Still a 3-2 game, right? You got the tying run on first. And then it goes 2-1 to Aaron Hicks. And Henderson takes off for second. Pitch was outside for ball 3. Jonah Heim, really good thrower behind the plate, former Orioles prospect, comes up firing, nabs Henderson at second for a huge caught stealing that kind of swung that 9th inning. And all the reactions, both during the game as it happened and after the game, were very odd. Like, they panned to Brandon Hyde on a replay, and he was basically given a reaction that said, why are we doing that? Like, he wasn't on board. They show Gunnar Henderson, who was looking into home plate multiple times as he's running towards second. And then you have Aaron Hicks, who was obviously disappointed by the fact that the runner was thrown out at second. And they asked Hicks, Hyde, and Henderson all after the game what happened. And Henderson said he got the sign from Hyde and staff to steal. And all Aaron Hicks and Brandon Hyde would say was that it was a miscommunication. Now, it is interesting that Brandon Hyde, who has been, so good with this clubhouse, would just call it a miscommunication. And Aaron Hicks, who has really been a veteran leader. Like, I've heard from some Orioles people, they love Aaron Hicks in that clubhouse. Every young player gravitates towards him, and him just saying it was a miscommunication. To me, between all of that, between Henderson's looking in, between Hyde's reaction, everything that happened on that play, and we didn't get a firm answer, right? Jacob Calvin-Meyer kind of wrote about what everyone said in the Baltimore Sun about specifically the caught stealing. What it seems like to me is that the sign that was put on was hit and run. It was a good spot for a hit and run, 2-1 count. You're not getting anything going offensively. You're trying to make something happen and get that run across in the 9th inning. You send Henderson. Hicks got a good pitch to hit on a hit and run. Like, it was a fastball that just barely missed off the outside corner. But that's a pitch where he can ground one where the shortstop would have been, except the shortstop's covering second, goes into left field. Henderson takes third. You got runners on the corners with nobody out, and you're cooking in the 9th inning. And he didn't swing at the pitch, and Henderson was looking back at home like you usually do on a hit and run, just to make sure it's not a line drive or a fly ball, so you don't have to turn around and run back to first base. And Henderson's out pretty easily. And I just think because of what Hicks said and what Hyde said, it felt like somewhat they were kind of covering for each other. Henderson trying to maybe just say, hey, it wasn't me, that's the young player. And Hyde and Hicks just having the understanding of, hey, we messed up. Let's just call it a miscommunication and let's move on from it. I don't think this is any issue in the Orioles clubhouse. They've had an incredible clubhouse vibe all year. They're going to get through this. But what I will say is it feels like to me that was a hit and run that was on, that Henderson got the sign and Hicks did not, and that was why Hyde was upset. It wasn't, why were you stealing? It was, why did Aaron Hicks not swing at that pitch? That's just my opinion. We didn't get the full answer from the Orioles. We may never know. Hopefully it's a moot point and the Orioles can turn this series on its head, but overall just not a good showing by the Orioles offense. Third thing you need to know is, speaking of Brandon Hyde, he showed us that he is going to use this entire roster. Now, we finally got announced on Saturday morning the Orioles ALDS roster with the 26 players. Ended up going with 14 hitters and 12 pitchers. A couple of changes from what I had predicted. And the big thing was that John Means had some elbow soreness after he threw a simulated game this week. Hyde said he wouldn't be ready for the ALDS, said he could be ready for the ALCS if they make it there, so he's left off the roster. They also leave Fuji off, and Brian Baker, somewhat surprisingly, gets the final pitching spot. But they only go with 12 pitchers, and I thought they wouldn't put Heston Kjerstad on the roster because of all the Rangers lefties. But Kjerstad did make it as the 14th hitter as well, and that's kind of what the roster looked like for the O's. But Hyde showed he wants to use a lot of the roster. He uses 12 of his 14 position players in this game. And he also used a good chunk of the bullpen without really totally tiring anyone out. I mean, he used 12 of his 14 position players, and he also used 6 of his 12 pitchers. That's pretty deep into your roster to go in your first postseason. Let's start with the hitters first. I mean, he was pretty quick to go to the bench. He used Adam Frazier as a pinch hitter in the 4th inning. Once the Rangers went to the bullpen, took the lefty Andrew Haney out, put the righty Dane Dunning in. He lifted the righty Westberg for a pinch hitter in Frazier. Thought that was the right move. I mean, that's what Hyde's been doing all year. Unfortunately, Frazier went 0 for 3 after Westberg had an 0 for 1 in the game. Also used Ryan O'Hearn in the 7th inning as a pinch hitter. Thought that was the right move as well. Like, you just couldn't let Arias hit there with the go-ahead run representing in the 7th. You never even know if that spot was going to come up again, and it turns out it did not in the order, so it was good to get O'Hearn in there. You want him to at least have an at-bat every game, even when he does not start. He's been that good for you this season. And unfortunately, he strikes out, and then because you're out of infielders, because you already put Frazier in, they entered Jorge Mateo to play defense for the final 2 innings as well. Now, that did mean you couldn't use him as a pinch runner in the final 2 innings, but there never really came a chance for the Orioles to use Jorge Mateo in that pinch running spot anyway. But then you go to the pitching side, and Brandon Hyde was pretty quick with the hook for Kyle Bradish. Bradish strikes out Adolis Garcia in the 5th, makes it 2 down, but he's already thrown 84 pitches. He's already given up 7 hits, and he pulls Bradish. And we'll kind of get to Kyle Bradish in a second, but he was willing to go to that bullpen and use the bullpen up. Danny Coulomb comes in to get the lefties, gets 2 outs. Jacob Webb comes in. He was really the only guy who struggled, right? And that was the spot for Jacob Webb. Like I said this on Twitter on Saturday, you know, Jacob Webb is not a high leverage guy at this point for the Orioles, but he's one of their at least solid middle relievers, and it's no surprise at all that he was on the postseason roster. And you don't have to use everybody, but you feel like Brian Baker and Jack Flaherty are both below Jacob Webb on like the bullpen trust power rankings for Brandon Hyde right now. So you had to figure Webb was going to be used at least once or twice in this series. And you look at the spot Webb came in, that's like the perfect spot to use Jacob Webb, right? You got already 1 out in the inning, you got the bases empty, and you have 8, 9, and 1 coming up, righty, lefty, righty. That's basically the perfect spot for Webb. You know, 6th inning of the game, not too high pressure, bases empty, just need 2 outs, and you got a couple of righties come up, especially at the bottom of the order. Unfortunately, Josh Young homers. He walks Taveras, and then Marcus Semien kind of bailed him out. He went 3-0 to Semien. Semien swung 3-0, flew out to the track in right center for the 2nd out of the inning, and that was it for Jacob Webb, who was not good. DL Hall was good, as we'll get to in a second. Then you get 3 outs from Tyler Wells. You get 2 outs from Cionel Perez, and the bullpen did great. I mean, the bullpen covered 4 1/3 innings, allowing 1 run. And Brandon Hyde wasn't, you know, scared of mixing and matching and using 5 different relievers and knowing that everyone but Hall, because he threw 28 pitches, is going to be available here on Sunday for Game 2 to come right back and help the Orioles win a game and even this series. I think we've seen this from Brandon Hyde some already, you know, how deep he'll go into his roster, how he likes to use every single piece he has. But he proved it to us on Saturday that he is willing to go deep into this roster to try and win a playoff series. Unfortunately, they didn't win. But what a lot of people have to understand is just because something doesn't work doesn't mean it wasn't the right process and the right decision. Brandon Hyde, I feel like, pulled pretty much all the right strings in this game. Most of them worked on the pitching side, except for Jacob Webb. Some of them didn't work on the hitting side, but they were strings that were pulled that worked all year, like Adam Frazier, pinch hitting, and Ryan O'Hearn, pinch hitting. Like those things had worked this season. Just didn't work in this one, unfortunately. Fourth thing you need to know from this one is that Kyle Bradish was good, not great, I'll say, in his first career postseason start. Bradish gets the ball and goes 4 2/3 innings, allowing 2 runs on 7 hits. He struck out 9, was awesome, and only walked 1, didn't allow a homer through 84 pitches. Now, you can have some qualms about, when Bradish was taken out of the game, didn't finish 5 innings in this game, gets the strikeout of Garcia, and then with the lefty and Evan Carter coming up, who the Orioles hadn't gotten out to that point, basically hadn't gotten out in the postseason so far to that point. They go to the left-hander, which worked to get him out of the inning. You could have let Bradish go longer, right? In a regular season game, he certainly would have continued to pitch, but this is the postseason, and you manage differently. And when you have a bullpen that's been off for 5 days, right, was off the entire week, they're never going to be this rested, and you feel like your bullpen gives you a better matchup, especially with all of those lefties in the Rangers lineup, you go to the bullpen, and that is what Hyde did. Now, in terms of what Bradish did while he was out there, the 9 strikeouts in 4 2/3 innings, we haven't seen that kind of K stuff in a while from Kyle Bradish, no matter how good he has been recently for the Orioles. The swing and miss stuff was there, 15 whiffs on 38 swings, really good 39% whiff percentage. The slider was unbelievable, 14 swings at the slider, and 8 of them were swings and misses. That was his number 1 pitch as usual. Now, it was interesting to see, because I talked about it earlier this week, how, the Rangers hit sliders well, so maybe Bradish would throw more fastballs. He still did throw more sliders, but it was actually more four-seam fastballs than he had thrown in a while. And the four-seam fastball wasn't bad, got some swings and misses. It was in the strike zone. It was a good pitch for him, and the velocity was where it usually is, 94 to 96. And I liked the mix from Bradish in this game. The pitch count got a little high there in the 5th inning, and that second inning was... That 4th inning, I should say, was really, really rough. I mean, he gave up 2 runs on 5 hits in the 4th inning, got a huge strikeout of Semien to strand the bases loaded to keep the Orioles in the game. But you could kind of tell in that 4th inning, the pitch count got up. He was giving up some hard contact, that he didn't have the A plus stuff. And I think that contributed to him being pulled in the 5th when he was. You just didn't want the 5th to turn into what the 4th was and really have this game get out of hand. But I fully still trust Kyle Bradish, if it does get to a Game 5, for him to start again and try and win this series for the Orioles. And the 5th and final thing you need to know from the O's 3-2 loss to the Rangers in Game 1 is that, honestly, the player that impressed me the most today in his playoff debut was DL Hall. DL Hall was outstanding. Hall comes into the game after Webb leaves in the 6th inning after giving up the homer, gets out of the 6th, gets them through the 7th, gets the first batter of the 8th. An inning and 2/3 hitless, scoreless baseball with 3 strikeouts and 1 walk for DL Hall. Did not allow a hard hit ball through 28 pitches, which does mean he's most likely going to be unavailable here on Sunday, but he will be the only reliever that is unavailable in this one in Game 2 for the Orioles. But, Hall was just... I was so impressed. 7 whiffs on 14 swings. That is an unbelievable 50% whiff rate. He got at least 1 swing and miss on all 4 of his pitches, 4-seamer, slider, changeup, and curveball. Mixed everything. That right there was the best we have seen DL Hall pitch out of the bullpen in an Orioles uniform, and he saved it for a postseason game. And it stinks that he pitched that well and the Orioles still lost the game. But, man, he was on it. From the first pitch that he threw, the velocity was up. You could tell he was amped up a bit. He was averaging 97 and was up to 99 with the fastball. The changeup looked good. The slider looked unhittable. He was very, very good in this one. And, again, the O's aren't going to have him Sunday, but when he's ready to go again in Game 3 on Tuesday, Brandon Hyde is going to go to him in a big spot because he is moving quickly up those bullpen trust rankings. That was just, even in the loss, that was awesome to see from DL Hall. But unfortunately, the Orioles do lose the game 3-2 and go down 1-0 in the series. And I get it. There's a lot to talk about from this game. And, there's some frustration about the offensive performance. And I get it. You want to have more than 5 hits and 2 runs in a postseason game. But they're not going to get away from what they've done. People who are saying Anthony Santander should have bunted in the 8th inning, like, come on, figure it out. Yes, it was a bad look for Gunnar Henderson to get thrown out, but it seemed like just a tough break, and maybe somebody didn't get the hit and run sign in that 9th inning. Sometimes in the postseason, things like this happen, you lose games. But the best part about winning the division is that you don't have to play in the AL wildcard, and you don't have to play a series where if you lose one game, you feel like your season is over. This is still a best of 5, and the Orioles will still run back out there today in Game 2. 4 o'clock start. Jordan Montgomery, the lefty, who the Orioles have seen a lot. He's made 16 career starts against the Orioles, has a 3.04 ERA. He was really good, 7 scoreless against Tampa on Tuesday. He'll go up against Grayson Rodriguez. Grayson's going to need that ace stuff in Game 2 here on Sunday. Both teams have most of the bullpen available. It's going to be fun to watch. And either way, whether the Orioles can tie this up at 1 game apiece or they go down 0-2, I'll be back with you on Monday morning, recapping Game 2, breaking down the roster a little bit more, and getting you ready for the Orioles trip to Texas in this series. But hope you enjoy this bonus weekend episode of the pod. I'm back on Monday. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.